I remember the first time I decided to camp near home instead of going far into the woods. It was one of those warm summer nights when the air hung heavy with humidity and the cicadas buzzed nonstop. I figured I didn't need to drive hours away to get that quiet outdoor experience. I had a small wooded area at the edge of my neighborhood, close to the trails and fields, far enough from the main road that I could pitch a tent and feel isolated. I thought it would be peaceful, almost like testing the waters of being outdoors without going too deep into the wild. But that night taught me that even close to home, things can happen that leave a mark on you forever. I got there late in the evening with just a backpack, a tent, and a small cooler. The sun was already low, the light cutting long shadows across the streets as I walked toward the trail entrance. By the time I set up the tent, the sky had turned orange and purple, then slowly faded into the thick darkness that only comes on summer nights. I could still hear faint sounds from the neighborhood, distant dogs barking, a car door shutting, someone's TV muffled through a window, but in my little patch of woods, it was mostly crickets and the rustle of leaves. I remember feeling proud of how quickly I had everything together. I sat for a while, listening to the hum of the night, enjoying the mix of the familiar neighborhood noises and the rawness of the trees around me. I eventually crawled into the tent. I left the flap half open to let in a breeze, the smell of grass and damp dirt heavy in the air. Sleep came slowly because the ground was lumpy and every sound felt amplified. I dozed for a bit, then wake up and check the time on my phone, the glow lighting up the nylon walls of the tent. Around midnight, I finally slipped into a deeper sleep, the kind where your body sinks and your mind lets go. It must have been close to 3 in the morning when I woke up. First, I didn't know why. My eyes adjusted to the dark, and I realized the crickets had gone silent. That silence always means something. I held my breath and listened. That's when I heard it. The sound of something moving fast, heavy but controlled, padding across the ground. First, I thought it was just a stray dog. Plenty of people in my neighborhood let their dogs roam, and they sometimes cut through the woods. But this sounded different, heavier, quicker. The steps weren't just random. They came in bursts like something sprinting, then stopping, then sprinting again. I sat up slowly, my sleeping bag tangled around me, and froze. My ears strained to make sense of it. I remembered someone once saying that on compost pickup day, raccoons and stray dogs go wild around here, digging through bins and dragging bags down the street. People even joked about it, saying the animals ran like packs, almost like wolves. That thought hit me hard. If it was a raccoon or two, fine. If it was dogs, though feral ones, big ones, then things could go bad quickly. The sound grew closer. My tent walls, thin as they were, made me feel trapped. I couldn't see anything. All I had was the shape of shadows moving against the faint glow of the neighborhood streetlights filtering through the trees. Then came the sound of panting. Not human, but heavy, hot breath. It pushed through the quiet and sent chills racing up my spine. I clutched the flashlight, clicked it on, and pointed it at the flap. The beam cut through the opening, catching flashes of movement. 2 glowing eyes reflected back at me for the briefest second before darting out of the light. Then another set appeared, and another. My stomach dropped. There weren't just 1 or 2 out there. There were several. At least 3, maybe 4. I could hear their claws scraping against the dirt as they circled. I sat completely still. My mind kept racing with thoughts of what to do. If I should yell, if I should stay silent, if I should unzip the tent and try to scare them off. But I remembered stories about stray dogs attacking people, especially if they moved too quickly or made themselves a target. I gripped the flashlight tighter and held my breath, waiting. One of them brushed against the side of the tent. The nylon caved inward, pushing right against my shoulder. My heart pounded so hard I thought they might hear it. Another pressed against the opposite side, and for a moment, the whole tent seemed surrounded. I could hear their sniffing now, sharp and deliberate, like they knew exactly where I was. My mouth went dry. The tent felt like paper. If they wanted to come in, nothing was stopping them. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. The animals kept circling, pressing, sniffing, testing the barrier. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The sounds faded, the padding of their paws grew faint, and the silence returned. Crickets began chirping again, cautiously at first, then steadily. My body sagged with relief, though the fear still locked me in place. I didn't dare move right away. I waited, flashlight still clutched in my hand, until I felt sure they were gone. Finally, I unzipped the tent slowly and poked my head out. The air outside felt colder, fresher, though my skin was damp with sweat. I swung the beam of the flashlight across the clearing. That's when I saw them, prints, all around my tent. Dozens of paw prints dug deep into the dirt, circling like they had been pacing and testing me from every angle. Some prints were big, much bigger than any domestic dogs. My chest tightened at the sight. I stepped out carefully, every sound amplified by my nerves. The woods were still again, but the tracks told me everything I needed to know. They had been right there, inches away, surrounding me. I thought about what could have happened if I had yelled, or if I had unzipped the tent too soon. I thought about the strength in those legs, the size of those prints, the way they worked together, running through the neighborhood like it was theirs. I didn't sleep again that night. I packed up my things quietly, my hands trembling, and sat with my back against a tree until the sky started to lighten. By morning, the neighborhood was waking up. Cars started, kids yelled to each other, and garbage trucks rolled by for compost pickup. To anyone else, it was just another normal day, but I couldn't stop replaying the night in my head. They had run through fast and confident, just like people said they did on pickup days. To me, though, it wasn't funny or casual anymore. It was real. They were out there, wild and fearless, and I was just lucky they hadn't decided I was worth more attention than a sniff and a circle. When I finally walked home, the sun warming my back, I couldn't shake the thought that the woods behind my neighborhood weren't just quiet patches of nature. They were claimed ground, and that night I had only been tolerated. That summer, I decided to head into the woods for a short camping trip. Nothing extreme, just a couple of days by myself to breathe and get away from the usual noise of life. I picked a site near a quiet lake about an hour and a half from town, a place I'd been before. I packed my tent, food, and the basics and hiked in early one morning. The weather was warm, clear, and bright, and the trail was dry from several days without rain. I didn't expect anything unusual. By the time I set up camp, the sun was sliding lower in the sky, and I could hear loons calling on the water. The air smelled of pine needles and damp earth. I boiled some water on my little stove, ate a quick meal, and sat near the fire pit, letting my body relax after the hike in. Everything felt calm, the way the woods usually do after the first night settles in. The next morning, I decided to hike further down an old logging road I'd seen on maps. It wasn't marked as an official trail anymore, but I knew it wound deeper into the forest and eventually looped back toward the lake from the far side. I figured I'd stretch my legs and see some new country before heading back to my site. The road was overgrown, with saplings and brush pushing up through cracks in the old gravel. The woods on either side were thick, full of birch, pine, and spruce. Birds moved in the trees, and now and then I'd hear squirrels scolding me from above. I didn't see any other hikers, which wasn't unusual this deep in. It was about halfway down that road when I first noticed something strange. At first, it was just movement in the brush off to my right. I assumed it was a deer or maybe even a moose. The snapping of branches wasn't sharp or sudden, more like steady weight moving across the ground. I slowed my pace, scanning through the trees. Then the sound stopped, and the forest went still. I kept walking, not wanting to spook myself over nothing. A few hundred yards later, the smell hit me. It was strong, musky, and heavy in the air, the kind of smell that sinks right into your throat. My chest tightened the moment I caught it because I'd smelled something like that before in smaller doses. It was the smell of a bear. I froze, standing still on the road, trying to pick out any sign of movement in the trees. My heart was hammering hard in my chest. That was when I saw a shape maybe 30 feet away. At first it was low to the ground, just a dark mass shifting through the brush. Then it rose up and I saw it clearly. A large black bear, easily 250, maybe 300 pounds. For a moment I couldn't move. The bear's head turned, and I realized it was looking right at me. It wasn't charging, but it wasn't leaving either. My chest went tight, and my mouth dried instantly. I knew that at this distance, if it decided to come at me, I wouldn't have time to react. Then the bear shifted, standing higher on its back legs, and I saw the sheer size of it. Its chest looked broad, its claws catching the sunlight as it moved. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I knew better. Instead, I started stepping backwards slowly, trying to put more space between us. My boots felt loud on the gravel, every crunch echoing in my ears. The bear didn't charge. It just stayed there, swaying slightly, sniffing the air. I realized then what might have drawn it close. Not far off the road, I could see the edge of an old dumpster half hidden by brush. It must have been left from years back when the road was in use. The lid was open, and I could see trash bags spilling out. The smell must have carried for miles. As I kept backing away, the bear eventually dropped back down on all fours and turned slightly toward the dumpster. That was all the chance I needed. I moved faster, still walking backward until I felt I was far enough to turn. Then I made a straight line back up the road, my heart slamming against my ribs. I didn't look back until I was sure I'd put several hundred yards between us. By the time I returned to camp, my legs felt like rubber. I sat down by the fire pit, staring out across the lake, and thought about how close that had been. 30 feet wasn't much at all. A bear that size could close the distance in seconds, and there wouldn't have been a thing I could do to stop it. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside the tent made me jolt awake. A twig snapping, the breeze rattling branches, even the distant hoot of an owl all set my nerves on edge. I kept replaying the sight of the bear standing tall in my head, the way it seemed to take in my presence. The next morning, I packed up and left early. The woods didn't feel the same anymore, at least not that trip. I walked back along the trail, checking behind me every few minutes, half expecting to see that dark shape moving through the trees again. When I finally reached my car and sat down in the driver's seat, the relief was so strong it left me shaking. I knew then that the encounter could have gone a lot worse. I'd read stories about people who hadn't been as lucky, people who had been mauled because they surprised a bear at close range. One swipe of a paw, one charge, and that would have been me. It left a mark on me that hasn't faded. Before, the woods had always been a place of calm and peace. I'd never thought much about real danger beyond the usual scrapes or sprained ankles. But after coming that close to a bear, I realized how quickly things could turn. The wilderness isn't there to comfort you. It's there on its own terms, and you're just passing through. I still go camping, but everything about the way I act out there has changed. I move more cautiously. I pay attention to smells and sounds I might have ignored before. I make sure my food is packed properly, nothing left out that could attract attention. And I never let myself forget that the quiet forest around me holds things that could kill me if I wasn't careful. That single moment, 30 feet from a bear, its dark eyes fixed on me, my heart stopping as I stepped backward, burned itself into my memory. I know how lucky I was. If it had decided differently, if hunger or aggression had taken hold, I might not be here to tell the story. The woods haven't stopped calling me, but they no longer feel like a safe escape. They feel like a reminder that survival isn't guaranteed, and sometimes you're just a few feet away from losing everything. That evening is burned into my memory more deeply than just about anything else I've ever experienced. It was a couple of years ago, but I can still see the details clearly, like my mind has decided it will never let me forget. My wife and I live in a rural area, not remote wilderness exactly, but far enough from town that we get all the wildlife you'd expect in the surrounding woods. Deer wander through our yard regularly. Foxes cross the fields. Coyotes call out at night. And every so often, a bear shows up. I had known this in an abstract sense, of course, but until that one encounter, I hadn't really felt it in the way you do when you're face to face with something that can take your life apart in seconds. It started on an ordinary evening. The sun was still up but beginning to sink, throwing long shadows across the backyard and painting everything in that warm gold light that makes even familiar places look like they belong in a different world. The air was still, thick with the smell of cut grass and damp earth. We had decided to walk down behind the property, past the edge of our mowed lawn and into the rougher area that led into the treeline. It wasn't unusual for us to do this after dinner. Stretch our legs, get some air, and just take in the quiet. We weren't expecting anything out of the ordinary. We were talking in low voices, the kind of idle back and forth that doesn't even matter, just enjoying each other's company. Then it happened, so fast that at first, I couldn't even process it. 30 feet away, maybe a little less, stood a bear. A black bear, big-bodied and solid, with a heavy head and small, dark eyes that locked on us almost immediately. I'd put it around 250 to 300 pounds, maybe more. It's hard to be exact when adrenaline starts running, but it was no cub. It was a full-grown male, no doubt about it. I remember the way the air seemed to change in that instant. The stillness deepened, like even the birds had gone quiet. My heart was hammering so hard in my chest it hurt, and my mind started racing with all the things I'd read about what you should do when you come face to face with a bear. Make yourself look big, don't run, back away slowly. It all blurred together in a jumble of panic and instinct. The bear didn't charge. It didn't even huff or move toward us. It just stood there, massive and solid, its nose twitching slightly as if it were sniffing the air, sizing us up. That alone was terrifying. Knowing it could come at us, knowing it had the power to break bones and tear through us like nothing, and yet it just stared, calm and watchful. Somehow, that quiet interest was even more unnerving than aggression would have been. We didn't say a word. We didn't even breathe loudly. I could feel my wife stiffen next to me, and I knew she was just as aware as I was that one wrong move could change everything. Without needing to discuss it, we both began to step backward. Not fast, not sudden, just slow, steady movements toward the house. Felt like forever. Every step back made my legs want to twitch and run, but I held it down, forcing myself to move evenly. The bear didn't follow, but it also didn't leave. It kept its eyes on us, its bulk framed against the line of the woods. I could almost hear my own pulse echoing in my ears, my throat dry as dust, my hands sweating even though the evening air had cooled. By the time we had closed the distance and hit the grass of our backyard again, the bear still hadn't moved. Only when the back door was within reach did we finally make a sharper motion. Walking quickly now, fumbling for the handle, pulling it open and slipping inside. The slam of the door behind us felt like the first real breath I'd taken since spotting it. From the kitchen window, we peered back out. The bear was still there, 30 feet away, standing calmly as if nothing unusual had happened at all. A few moments later, it dropped its head and began to move toward the edge of the yard, not rushing, just lumbering along with that heavy, rolling gait. It disappeared into the treeline and was gone. That was it. No charge, no swiping claws, no violent ending. But I'll tell you, the fear that had taken root in me during those few minutes has lasted far longer than if it had simply bolted away. I had been close enough to see the muscles under its coat shift as it breathed, close enough to see how its paws pressed into the earth, close enough to realize how little control I actually had in that situation. Ever since that day, I've been different outdoors. Walking behind our house doesn't feel the same. Hiking in the woods, something I used to do without much thought, now comes with a heavy weight in the back of my mind. I scan the treeline constantly, watch for movement, listen for sounds I would have ignored before. Every snapping twig feels like it could mean something big and dangerous nearby. Even when I mow the lawn at dusk, I find myself glancing up more often than I ever used to, checking the edges of the property. That bear never laid a paw on us. It didn't even act aggressively. But being 30 feet from a wild animal that powerful changed everything about the way I think when I'm outside. Before, the woods had felt like a place of peace, of quiet and space. Now they feel like something else entirely. A place where I'm always a visitor, never in control, always one heartbeat away from something I might not walk away from. And that's the truth I've carried with me ever since. One evening, one silent stare from 30 feet away, and the outdoors has never felt the same. I was somewhere in the middle of the White Mountains during the summer, moving along a quiet stretch of trail that wound through dense pines and hardwoods. The sun was just beginning to clear the treetops, the early light spilling through gaps in the branches, painting long shadows across the ground. The air was still cool, damp from the night, carrying that sharp earthy scent that always clung to the forest at dawn. My boots crunched lightly over roots and loose rocks, and for the most part, it was just another quiet morning of backpacking. I hadn't seen another soul in hours, but as I rounded a bend and began heading down toward a small hollow, I felt something change. The stillness of the woods wasn't the normal kind. It was deeper, heavier, the sort of silence that presses down until you realize you can't hear a single bird or even the usual whisper of wind moving the leaves. My gut tightened as I slowed my pace. The trail dipped lower, and that's when I saw it. At first glance, it looked like the remains of a campsite, but not the usual kind. A shredded tent lay crumpled under a tree, the fabric torn apart in jagged strips, poles bent at awkward angles. Gear was scattered in the dirt, some of it broken, other pieces half buried in pine needles as though they'd been tossed around. My eyes caught on movement near the base of the tree, and I froze. There, slumped against the trunk, was a person. They looked like they had crawled there and barely managed to stay upright. Their clothes were torn, soaked with blood, and their skin was covered in cuts, punctures, and deep gashes that looked so bad I had to blink to make sure I wasn't imagining them. For a second, I thought I had stumbled into the aftermath of some kind of attack straight out of a horror movie. The figure let out a low, pitiful sound, more like a whimper than words, and that was when I realized how real it was. I dropped my pack immediately and went into autopilot. I always carried a basic medical kit, enough for scrapes, blisters, and minor injuries, but nothing that seemed close to what I was looking at now. Still, I dug it out, grabbed my water bottle, and hurried over. His arms and hands were slashed to ribbons with what looked like defensive wounds, long cuts that ran across the forearms as though he had tried to shield himself from something clawing at him. Deeper slashes carved diagonally from shoulder to hip, and his back showed several puncture wounds spaced out in a way that made me think of something heavy raking him with force. He was barely holding on, his breathing shallow, eyes half-lidded, face pale and slick with sweat. I cleaned what I could, pressing gauze into the worst of the gashes and wrapping with every bit of bandaging I had. The bleeding slowed in some places, though it was clear he needed far more help than I could offer. I poured water into his mouth slowly, careful not to choke him, and he swallowed weakly before drifting back toward a kind of dazed half-sleep. I glanced around the destroyed campsite, trying to piece together what had happened, but there were no obvious signs. No animal nearby, no human attacker lurking, just the quiet, empty woods. I checked my map with trembling hands. I knew there was a road not too far from where I was, maybe less than 2 miles if I kept a steady pace. The problem was leaving him alone long enough to get help. My mind ran through the options quickly before I decided the best chance was to carry what I could, keep him stabilized, and make a run for the road. I left most of my own gear behind, only keeping the essentials in case I needed to signal someone, then adjusted his arms over my shoulder and tried to help him to his feet. He barely moved, so I ended up dragging him part of the way, supporting his weight while stumbling over roots and rocks, each step a fight against both gravity and his limp body. It was grueling, but eventually the sound of passing cars drifted faintly through the trees, and I stumbled out onto a strip of asphalt. I waved my arms at the first vehicle I saw, a beat-up sedan that slowed and pulled over. The driver looked stunned at the sight of the bloodied man hanging off me, but I managed to wave them toward the woods. They didn't stick around long, just sped off, promising to send help. I laid the injured man down on the grassy shoulder and waited. The minutes dragged into nearly an hour before I heard the distant wail of sirens. Relief washed over me as rescue crews pulled up and rushed out with stretchers, gear, and medical kits far more advanced than anything I carried. I helped guide them back toward the site, explaining as best I could what I had found. I was certain he wouldn't survive, not with the sheer amount of blood he had lost, but against all odds, he clung on. Together, we hauled him back to the ambulance. One of the rescue workers offered me a ride to their station in town, where I could clean up and rest. My shirt and arms were smeared with his blood, the smell clinging to me long after I'd scrubbed my hands raw under the station sink. Before I left, I gave them my number, asking if they could call with any update. 3 days later, When I finally made it home, I found a message on my answering machine. The voice explained that the man had survived, though barely. The story they pieced together from him made my skin crawl. He had decided on a whim to go camping with no real experience. Somewhere along the way, he had read or been told that to keep bears away, you had to hang your food from a tree. He followed that advice, but did it wrong. He strung his food bag almost directly over his tent, and not high enough. Sometime during the night, a black bear came sniffing around. It smelled the food, pawed at the tree, and climbed right over the tent in its effort to reach it. The man woke up to the weight of the bear pressing down, claws digging into his flesh as it tried to hoist itself upward. The slashes, the puncture wounds, the shredded tent. It all made sudden, awful sense. He had fought back the only way he could, shielding himself while the bear scrambled above him, until somehow it gave up and moved on. He survived, but just barely. The final note of the message stuck with me. The man had sworn, while recovering in the hospital, that he was done with the woods forever. He said he was moving to the city, away from bears, away from tents, away from trees. Couldn't blame him. The image of his ruined campsite stayed burned in my mind long after. The forest that morning had looked like something out of a nightmare, and I knew I'd never forget it. It was a sobering reminder of how unforgiving the wilderness can be when someone walks in unprepared. Out there, small mistakes can turn into near death in the blink of an eye. And sometimes survival isn't about skill, it's just about luck. That man had been lucky enough that I stumbled across him when I did. If I had chosen a different trail that morning, or if I had started hiking just a little later, I don't think he would have been alive when anyone found him. That thought has haunted me every time I step into the woods since. I had been out in the backcountry many times before, but there was something about that particular trip that stayed burned into my memory. I had decided to spend 3 nights camping alone in a remote forested valley where there were no marked trails and no cabins nearby, just miles and miles of thick trees, rocky ridges, and the quiet kind of wilderness that felt both beautiful and intimidating. I had planned the trip carefully, brought enough food, water filters, and gear, and thought I was prepared for anything. What I didn't expect was how one encounter would change the way I felt about being out there. The first day went smoothly. I hiked deep into the woods, far away from the dirt road I had parked on, following a faint game trail until I found a small clearing near a stream. I set up my tent, got a fire going, and cooked a simple meal before dark. The air was cool but not freezing, and aside from the rustle of leaves and the distant sound of water running over rocks, it was quiet. That night, I fell asleep quickly, the way I usually did after hours of hiking. The second day, I wandered farther, explored ridges, and took notes in a small notebook I always carried. I liked being out in places where there weren't other people, where it felt like I was completely cut off from roads, phones, and the noise of daily life. The woods were thick, with tall pines and scattered patches of undergrowth, and sometimes it was so still that I could hear my own breathing louder than anything else. When I returned to camp that evening, I cooked again and sat by the fire until the last of the daylight was gone. It was in the middle of that second night when I first woke up with an uneasy feeling. At first I thought it was just the wind or maybe a dream, but then I realized it wasn't either. The sound was real. It was the kind of sound that makes you sit up straight and hold your breath without thinking. Something was moving outside the tent. Not just a squirrel or a rabbit. It was heavier. The ground gave a faint crunch under its weight, and it moved with a slow, deliberate rhythm. I stayed completely still, straining to hear. A twig snapped. My chest tightened. Then I heard it again. Footsteps, steady and soft but heavier than anything small. My first thought was a deer, maybe even an elk, but the way it moved felt different. Lower to the ground. Slower. My mind raced. Bears crossed my mind, but the steps weren't heavy enough. Then, as I held my breath, I heard another sound that froze me. A low, drawn-out howl carried faintly through the trees. It was far at first, then another answered, closer. I felt a chill spread through me that no blanket could fix. Wolves. I had read about them in the area but had never seen or heard them in person until that night. Lying there in a thin tent, with nothing but nylon between me and whatever was moving out there, I suddenly felt very small. The footsteps circled near my camp, slow and steady. I could hear breathing, soft, steady exhales that weren't mine. I had no weapon, only a small knife I kept with my cooking gear. My food was hung up high between two trees, away from camp, so at least that wasn't drawing them in. But something about the smell of my fire pit, or maybe just curiosity, had brought them close. Minutes dragged like hours. The sound of movement would fade, then return from another angle. Once, I was sure something brushed against the side of the tent, so lightly that it might have been my imagination, but I knew it wasn't. My heart pounded so loud I was convinced they could hear it. At some point, I reached slowly for my flashlight. I thought about shining it outside, but then stopped. I didn't know if that would scare them away or draw more attention. So I sat there, gripping the light, waiting, listening to every sound until finally, after what felt like forever, the forest quieted. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I just lay there, listening, until a pale gray light began to seep into the fabric of the tent. When I finally unzipped it and stepped out, the ground told me everything I needed to know. There were paw prints all around the clearing, large, distinct prints circling and crisscrossing. I counted at least 5 different sets. They had been right there, pacing around while I sat frozen inside. That day, I stayed closer to camp than I'd planned. I gathered firewood, kept the fire going, and tried to shake the nervous edge I felt. The woods were still beautiful, the stream still calming, but everything felt different. I couldn't shake the image of those prints and the way they had circled me. That night, I kept the fire burning brighter than usual, piling on wood as the darkness grew. It gave me comfort, even though I knew fire wasn't always enough to keep animals away. I forced myself to eat, cleaned my cookware, and sat as long as I could before finally retreating to the tent. Sometime past midnight, I woke again. This time, there was no mistaking the sound. A howl cut through the night, closer than before, echoing through the trees. My stomach turned. Another answered, farther away, then another, weaving a pattern that boxed me in. The fire outside had burned low, and the woods around me seemed alive with sound. I gripped the flashlight again, heart hammering. A rustle came from the edge of the clearing, then the crunch of movement, deliberate and circling just like the night before. I imagined glowing eyes just beyond the tree-line, watching. The urge to unzip the tent and run was strong, but there was nowhere to go. Out there in the open, I would be even more vulnerable. I stayed inside, every muscle tense, until eventually the noises faded again. Whether they had lost interest or simply decided to move on, I didn't know. But once again, I didn't sleep until daylight. When morning came, I walked the clearing again. The paw prints were fresh. I could see where they had stopped, pressed deeper into the earth as if standing still and waiting. My fire pit was disturbed, the ashes scattered. My stomach sank. They had been closer than I thought. By the third night, I had made my decision. I had planned to stay longer, but the thought of spending another sleepless night surrounded by those sounds didn't sit right with me. Camping alone had always been a way for me to clear my mind, to feel at peace. But this time, it had turned into something else. A reminder of how fragile I really was out there, how quickly the quiet could turn to danger. That morning, I packed up camp. My gear was stuffed away quickly, the fire buried, and I hiked back through the woods with a constant feeling of being watched. Every snap of a twig made me turn. Every shadow between the trees made me tighten my grip on my pack straps. The forest felt different than when I had first entered. No longer calm, no longer peaceful, but alive and watchful. When I finally stepped back onto the dirt road where my car waited, the relief was overwhelming. I had made it out unharmed, but the experience left a mark on me. The prints, the howls, the steady circling steps outside my tent. They reminded me that out there, I wasn't the one in control. I still camp, and I still hike deep into the wilderness, but I never forget that feeling. Wolves are part of the wild, just like the rivers and trees, but knowing how close they came to me, how easily it could have gone another way, has never left my mind. The forest doesn't bend for me, and that night was the clearest reminder I've ever had. That trip ended with me safe at home, but it also ended with a memory I'll never shake. The sound of paws circling my tent in the darkness, and the knowledge that I was only lucky they chose not to come closer. I still remember one camping trip that shook me so much I thought about quitting camping altogether. I had gone out to the bush with a few friends, the kind of trip we used to take almost every summer when the weather was good and we wanted to get away from the noise of the city. We didn't pack much, just the basics: sleeping bags, a bit of food, and enough water to last until we came back. We wanted to be out under the stars, far from roads and lights, somewhere it felt like the wild was right on top of us. The hike in had been tough but worth it. We followed a narrow track that wound up a ridge and dropped down toward a creek. By the time we reached the spot we usually camped at, the sun was starting to slide lower, casting long shadows between the trees. It was quiet except for birds overhead and the occasional rustle of leaves. That kind of silence is both calming and unnerving. You feel free, but at the same time you know you're a long way from help if anything goes wrong. We laid out our sleeping bags and gathered wood for a fire. The smell of smoke curled up through the branches and blended with the damp smell of dirt and plants. Felt good, like so many other nights I had spent out in the bush. Nothing about it seemed unusual at first. As the night went on, the firelight flickered against the trees. We sat around, eating, talking, and listening to the sounds around us. The wind would sweep through in short bursts, rattling the branches and pushing smoke in different directions. Every so often I thought I heard something heavier than wind, something stepping through the undergrowth, but I told myself it was just my nerves. Out in the wild, your ears play tricks on you. Eventually we crawled into our bags, letting the fire die down until it was only glowing coals. The stars were brilliant overhead, clear and sharp. I drifted off slowly, listening to the sounds of the forest. That's when I heard it. Something low and distant at first, then closer. A long, rising howl that echoed across the ridge. At first, I thought maybe it was a dog from some farm miles away, but the sound was different. It was deeper, sharper at the end. My body tensed in a way I couldn't control. My friends were asleep already, breathing heavily, but I lay there frozen, staring into the dark. Another howl came, closer this time, and I knew without a doubt it was a wolf. I had read about wolves, knew they weren't supposed to attack people unless they were starving or felt threatened. Still, the thought of one being close was enough to make my skin crawl. I sat up slowly, trying to listen through the silence that followed. My heart thumped so loud I thought it might give me away. Then I heard movement, soft but steady, like paws on leaves. It circled the camp, far enough that I couldn't see it, but close enough I knew it was watching. I grabbed a stick from near the fire pit and stirred the coals, sending up sparks and a bit of flame. The light flared just enough to make me feel less exposed. I stayed like that for a long time, feeding small bits of wood into the fire, hoping the glow would keep it back. The night dragged on endlessly. Sometimes it would go quiet for a stretch and I would start to think maybe it had left, but then I'd hear it again. The sound of breathing, the crack of a twig under weight, or that awful low growl rolling through the trees. My stomach felt tight, and I couldn't shake the idea that if it was hungry enough, the fire wouldn't matter. Around midnight, the wind picked up and clouds drifted across the stars. The darkness grew heavier, pressing down around the edges of the firelight. I caught a glimpse of movement then, just at the edge of the glow. A shape slipped between the trees, quick and silent, but the outline was clear enough. A lean body, tail low, head level with its back. My chest went cold. I forced myself not to panic, though every instinct screamed at me to run. Running would have been the worst thing I could do. Instead, I crouched low, feeding the fire and keeping my eyes on that shifting darkness. My throat was dry, and every breath felt shallow. The wolf lingered, pacing, circling. Sometimes it stopped and watched. I could almost feel its eyes on me, yellow in the half-light, testing my resolve. It didn't rush in, but it didn't leave either. Time blurred. I felt trapped, waiting, my mind darting between what I knew of wolves and the reality of one right there in front of me. At some point, my friends stirred and rolled in their bags but stayed asleep. I envied them, wished I could shut my eyes and forget, but my body wouldn't allow it. I stayed locked in place, firelight painting my face, listening to the wolf breathe in the dark. Finally, near dawn, the first faint light touched the sky. The birds began to call and the air shifted. With the coming of morning, the wolf grew less bold. It circled one last time, then slipped away between the trees, silent as smoke. My body sagged with relief, though I didn't let myself move for a long while. When the sun finally rose enough to brighten the camp, everything looked normal again. Just trees, dirt, and the remains of our small fire. My friends stretched and yawned, none the wiser to what had happened. I looked around at the tracks pressed into the ground, paw prints clear in the mud, circling us again and again. My stomach turned at the sight. That last paragraph is a relief to me even now because it reminds me I made it through. I faced a predator in the dark and somehow came out unharmed. But it changed me. Ever since that night, I never camp without keeping the fire burning strong. And I never forget that when you're out in the bush, you're not the only one living there. The animals don't care who you are or what you've brought. You're just another presence in their world. And sometimes, if you're unlucky, they'll come close enough to remind you. I was hiking a section of the Appalachian Trail with two of my close buddies, the kind of trip we had talked about for a long time. The weather was cool, a thin breeze cutting through the thick green canopy above, and our packs felt heavier than usual, but spirits were high. We were deep in the woods, miles from the nearest road or town, and there was a strange comfort in knowing that civilization was so far behind us. The trail twisted and rolled up and down ridges, through mossy rocks and across little creeks that forced us to hop carefully from stone to stone. It was later in the afternoon, the light softening into that golden shade that makes the forest look older and quieter, when we came across it. Right in the middle of the trail, leaning against a flat gray rock, was a bundle of sticks tied together into a kind of figure. It wasn't just a pile. It had been made intentionally, arranged into an angular, almost human-like shape. The way the sticks bent and crossed, it reminded me of something I had seen in old horror movies, though here in the woods it didn't feel entertaining. It felt deliberate. We all stopped, standing over it, the three of us silent for a long moment. It was out of place, obviously put there on purpose, and yet there wasn't a sign of anyone around. No voices in the distance, no crack of branches under someone's boots. Just this figure staring up at us like it had been waiting. I bent down and picked it up, turning it over in my hands. It was simple, just dead branches tied with something thin like twine or stripped bark. I don't know why I did it, maybe just to break the weird tension, but I slid it into my backpack, thinking it was interesting enough to keep as a strange souvenir. One of my friends gave me a look, like he didn't love the idea, but no one said anything. We just moved on. By the time the sun started to drop behind the ridges, we had covered enough ground to be satisfied for the day. We found a flat patch of earth a little ways off the trail, ringed by tall trees, and decided to set up camp. We went through the familiar process. Tents up, food cooked over a small fire, the kind of routine that feels comforting in the middle of nowhere. My legs ached from the miles, and when I finally sat back after eating, I felt the weight of exhaustion settle in. The forest was calm that night. No loud animals, no wind strong enough to rattle the branches. Just a steady background of crickets and the occasional distant snap of a twig. After the long day, none of us stayed up late. Once the fire burned low, we turned in, each of us crawling into our tents, the glow of our headlamps winking out one by one. Sleep came fast. At dawn, I was the first to stir. The air was damp and cool, the kind of chill that makes you want to curl deeper into your sleeping bag, but the thought of hot coffee pulled me out. I unzipped the tent, stretching stiff muscles as I stepped into the pale morning light. The fire from the night before was nothing but ash and charred wood, a small black scar on the ground. That's when I saw it. Sitting right on top of the ash was another bundle of sticks. It was nearly identical to the one I had stuffed in my pack the day before. Same crossed limbs, same crude shape, even the same rough size. It wasn't half done or sloppy. It looked like it had been made with the same pattern, almost as though it had been traced. For a long moment I just stood there, staring at it. My first instinct was to check my pack. I hurried back to the tent, unzipped it, and pulled my backpack out. I dug through clothes, food, gear, until my fingers brushed against the rough ends of the original figure. I pulled it free, my stomach tightening. Sure enough, it was still there, exactly as I'd taken it from the trail, which meant someone had made another and placed it in our camp while we slept. When the others woke, I showed them what I'd found. Both swore up and down they hadn't done it, and I believed them, at least in that moment. We had all crashed hard after the long hike, and none of us had reason to get up in the middle of the night just to build something like that. It unsettled me to think about someone creeping silently into our sight, close enough to leave it without waking any of us. All morning, I couldn't shake the thought of it. The woods suddenly felt different. Every snapped twig made me tense. Every shadow between the trees felt like it might be hiding someone. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see movement that wasn't there. My buddies tried to brush it off, saying maybe one of us was messing around, but their voices didn't sound as casual as they tried to make them. I noticed the way they kept looking at the tree line too. We packed up faster than usual that morning and hit the trail, but I carried a heavy unease in my gut. With every step, the bundle of sticks pressed against the inside of my pack, reminding me it was still there. I thought about just throwing it away, but for some reason I didn't. Maybe part of me wanted to prove it was just nothing, that it really was just a strange prank. The rest of the hike that day was quieter than usual. We didn't joke around much, didn't stop as often. Every time we passed a bend in the trail or dipped into a hollow, I scanned the trees, expecting to see another figure tied to a branch or leaning against a rock. But nothing else appeared, just the silence of the woods, broken only by our footsteps and the birds overhead. That night we set camp again, this time deeper in a thicker part of the forest. I tried to push the unease down, focusing instead on the fire, the warmth of food, and the exhaustion in my muscles. But when I lay down in my tent, the sound of the forest outside felt sharper. Every shift of the wind through the branches made me flinch. I kept thinking about how close someone must have been to us the night before, how easily they had moved in and out without us noticing. The next morning came without incident. No new bundle of sticks appeared, no sign of anyone else in the area. But the feeling never really went away. Even after we finished the trip and got back home, I couldn't stop replaying it in my head. I never figured out if one of my friends had pulled the prank and refused to admit it, or if there had been someone else out there, hidden in the woods, watching us sleep. I still have the figure I picked up that day. It sits in a box in my garage, dusty and brittle now. Sometimes I think about throwing it away, but I never do. Part of me wants to keep it as proof, though proof of what I'm not sure. Maybe just proof of how fragile that sense of safety in the woods can be, how quickly it can turn into something that makes your skin crawl. I want to believe it was a joke, that one of my friends went to more effort than they ever admitted. Because the alternative, that someone else was out there, following us close enough to creep into our camp unseen, is something I'd rather not picture too closely. But I can never quite convince myself either way. That last morning when I saw the second bundle sitting on the ashes of our fire, I realized something that stayed with me. Out in the wilderness, you never really know who else is there, and sometimes it's scarier not knowing than anything you could see head on. When I think back on it now, I can only shake my head at how careless I was. At the time, though, I thought it was just harmless fun, something kind of clever and adventurous. It was one of those choices that doesn't feel dangerous in the moment but leaves you realizing afterward just how close you came to making a huge mistake. The memory still sticks with me, especially because I had been camping alone and had no one else to blame but myself. It was midsummer, one of those sticky weeks when the air feels heavy even in the middle of the forest. I had driven out to a small state forest that I'd only visited once before, a place with a few scattered trails and some backcountry spots where people rarely went. My goal was to set up camp near a stream I remembered passing the last time. I liked the sound of running water when I slept, and I figured it would be a good spot to cook and cool off. The hike in wasn't long, maybe 3 miles from the trailhead, but it felt longer with the heat. The trees didn't block the sun as much as I thought they would, and by the time I reached the stream, my shirt was stuck to my back with sweat. The water looked clean, clear enough to see every pebble on the bottom, with tiny fish darting in the deeper sections. The bank was lined with smooth rocks, and the air felt slightly cooler there. It seemed like the perfect place to set up camp. I pitched my tent in a small clearing just a little uphill from the water, making sure it wasn't too close in case of rain. After setting up my sleeping pad and unrolling my bag, I sat on a flat rock near the stream and dug through my backpack for my food. I had brought some trail mix, jerky, and a couple of sealed pouches of rice and beans for dinner, but I wanted something different, something refreshing. That's when the idea hit me. In the front pocket of my pack, I had a Ziploc bag with some tea bags I'd tossed in at the last minute. I'd been drinking iced tea constantly at home because of the heat, and I thought it might be fun to make some sun tea out there in the woods. I could already imagine it. Letting the tea steep in the sun while I relaxed by the water, then sipping it later with dinner. That was when I noticed the small wooden post sticking out of the ground a few yards upstream. The letters were faded, but I could make them out if I squinted. "Do not drink water." I paused for a second. The water looked fine, clearer, in fact, than half the bottled stuff I'd bought before. I figured it was just one of those warnings the park put up as a blanket precaution. Maybe they didn't want people thinking they could drink straight from it without filtering. I had my filter with me anyway, so what harm could it do? But instead of running the water through my filter, I decided to just fill my bottle straight from the stream. I told myself it was harmless. After all, I wasn't going to gulp it down. I was just going to let it sit in the sun with the tea bag. Somehow, in my head, that felt like enough to make it safe. So I filled my bottle, dropped in a tea bag, sealed it, and set it on a sunlit rock. I leaned back against another boulder, feeling proud of my little idea. Hours passed in a lazy haze. I spent the afternoon walking the bank, tossing pebbles into deeper pools, watching insects skim over the surface. Every so often, I glanced at the bottle, noticing how the water turned darker as the tea steeped. It looked perfect, like something you'd see in a photo about refreshing summer drinks. By evening, when the sun was low and the air finally started to cool, I brought the bottle back up to my camp and poured it into my cup. The first sip was warm and bitter but satisfying. It wasn't anything fancy, but out there with nothing else but jerky and rice, it felt like a luxury. I finished the cup with dinner, then drank the rest of the bottle slowly as the sky darkened. It wasn't until later, lying in my tent, that I noticed my stomach felt tight. At first, I thought it was just the beans, since camp food usually hits harder than normal meals. But within an hour, the cramping grew sharper. I tried to shift positions, curling up on my side, but the pressure just kept building. Then came the nausea. By midnight, I was crawling out of the tent, my head spinning and staggering toward the trees. I barely made it far enough before I doubled over. The sickness came in waves, each one worse than the last, until my throat felt raw and my stomach ached like it had been wrung out. I sat on the ground, sweating in the cool night air, shivering despite the heat that clung to my skin. My head pounded, and every sound around me, the rustling of leaves, the faint ripple of water, felt too loud. I knew it wasn't normal food poisoning. Something about that water had gotten into me. The worst part was being alone. No one knew exactly where I had camped. I thought about how far I was from my car, from the nearest road, and how weak I felt already. My legs shook when I tried to stand, and I had to brace myself on a tree just to stay upright. I stumbled back toward the tent, clutching my stomach, and sat inside with my flashlight off. The woods pressed in around me, every shadow heavy and close. I kept thinking about the sign, "Do not drink water." I had ignored it just like some fool in a movie who thinks they know better. And now I was paying for it. The night dragged on, one long stretch of misery broken only by more trips outside. Each time I thought I couldn't get sicker, my body proved me wrong. I started to worry about dehydration, about the fact that I had no clean water left to drink, only that cursed stream a few feet away. I thought about packing up and hiking back to the car in the dark, but I didn't have the strength. All I could do was wait. By dawn, the cramps had dulled, leaving me drained and hollow. My body felt wrung out, like every ounce of energy had been taken from me. I sat at the edge of the stream, staring at the bottle I'd left on the rock, its tea bag still floating inside. The water was so clear, so inviting, but I couldn't look at it without feeling sick all over again. When I finally managed to pack up camp, my legs felt shaky under the weight of my gear. The hike back to the car was the longest 3 miles I've ever walked. Every step was slow, deliberate, with my mouth dry and my head light. I kept picturing myself collapsing on the trail, no one finding me for days. But somehow I made it. I drove home in silence, every bump in the road sending a new ache through my stomach. By the time I reached my house, I collapsed on the couch and slept for nearly an entire day. It took me a full week to feel normal again. The whole time, I kept replaying that moment in my head, standing by the stream, looking at the sign, deciding it didn't matter. I thought I was being clever, making something out of nothing. But all I did was gamble with my health, maybe even my life, over a cup of tea. Now, whenever I camp, I carry extra water and double-check my filter. I don't cut corners and I don't shrug off warnings, because that night taught me something simple and clear. Out there, the smallest careless decision can turn into the scariest experience of your life, and I'll never ignore a sign like that again.